Hello, everyone, and welcome to ConnectedLearning.tv. I'm Jeff Brazil, and I'm part of the team here at ConnectedLearning.tv. This is webinar number 53 for us, so we are first week into the second year, and it's been a great year of conversations and challenging questions and telling great stories about great things that people are doing out there in regards to connected learning. A few quick details before we dive into today's conversation. To those of you watching on live stream, we really encourage you to use the chat stream to introduce yourselves and connect with one another, share resources, ask questions. We'll do the best we can to pull those questions into the Hangout with our guests today. And then speaking of the Hangout in Google and Google+, we have a brand new connected learning community that's just a few weeks old, but it already has about 800 people in it that we'd love for you to be a part of. Take a look at the conversations that are unfolding there and the folks that are there and see if that's something that would be that would interest you. We'd love to have you be part of that. The link to the G+ community should already be in the live stream chat as well. And then lastly, the URL for our public group notes doc for today's session should also be in the live stream chat as well. And it's always a huge help if you help us take notes and capture highlights and share the resources that are either mentioned in the Hangout conversation today or your own to pull in there that we can share after the fact. And today's topic is choice-based assessment as learning, not just an instructional ingredient. And before our guest speaker, Dylan Arena, begins helping us frame today's conversation, I wanted everyone in the Hangout to kind of introduce yourself quickly and sort of say quickly what your connection is to today's topic and what brings you to it. So let's start over on what I see on the left with Ben and Ethan and Brian.
I'm Ben Shapiro. I'm a professor at Tufts University in computer science and education, and I design game simulation and engineering systems for kids to learn with. And I'm really interested in thinking about how we make these open-ended spaces where kids have lots of choice about what they're going to do and that we learn things from those choices as they're choosing how to solve problems.
My name is Ethan Danahy. I'm a computer science professor here at Tufts, and my research area is, in a similar vein, is educational technologies. And so thinking about new hardware, software, and interfaces for classrooms, and we look at K-12 through university, and thinking about how to stimulate creativity, how to get people collaborating, how to get them documenting the entire process of what they're creating versus just the final product. And of course, along that way, trying to think about how do we evaluate what they're doing and having that as a feedback loop into what they're creating.
And I'm Brian O'Connell. I'm a student here at Tufts University, a doctoral student, and my research has been in paperbots, basically inexpensive robotics for classrooms to make it more affordable to get engineering education in the classroom. And through that, I've done some quantifying of creativity in evaluating to better evaluate students and have some quantitative measures that you can communicate between administration and teachers and comparing different activities.
Thanks, guys. Carla?
Hi, everybody. I'm Carla Casilli. I'm with Mozilla Foundation, and I work on open badges. And open badges, we've developed a universal standard for digital badging. And part of the design there is to acknowledge that learning happens everywhere in informal and formal settings. And we are very interested in using them as alternative methods or recognition of alternative methods of assessment and criteria based on learning. So the idea of choice-based assessment makes a lot of sense for us.
Thank you, Carla. Mitch?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mitch Hare. I'm from the Institute of Production Recording up in Minneapolis, and we've got a school here, about 300 students who are working on audio production and sound design for visual media, and we're expanding into creative development for other types of programs. So I'm interested to find out more about, connected learning and how it relates specifically to our students and how they can end up as creative developers.
Great, thanks, Mitch. Tim?
Yep.
Hey everybody, I'm Tim Lord. I'm the co-founder and co-executive director of DreamYard. We're an arts learning organization based in the Bronx. We work with a community of 42 public schools along a pathway model, helping them develop robust arts programs with the idea of helping connect young people to college and career, and also work with many of those same young people as teenagers at our art center, where we have traditional art forms and then a whole digital learning program and a U-Media space. We're the only U-Media space currently in a community setting. We're here in an affordable housing building in the Bronx. And my connection and interest is that we ask all of our young people to reflect constantly on their process as artists. And I think that the idea of choice making is so key to an artist, and choice-based assessment is a very exciting way of making that explicit, and then also starting to capture some of those decision-making processes and helping young people sort of get better at it. So I'm fascinated by that. I also think it's going to potentially level the playing field, because the assessments, we work with young people for whom the standard assessments are so deeply inequitable that I'm excited about ways to make that whole process much more equitable.
Thanks everybody for being here. This is we all know is an important topic. It sometimes doesn't get quite as much enthusiasm as energy as it deserves. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So to start us off, our special guest today is Dylan Arena, and Dylan is the co-founder and chief learning scientist at Kidaptive, a technology company which is dedicated to creating entertaining and adaptive content that helps children learn. And along with Daniel Schwartz, Dylan produced a report titled Measuring What Matters Most, which explores the purpose of assessment and choice-based assessment design. And I have to say, having read the report 2 times now, it's one of the few academic reports that has the term blood elves in it. So you don't want to miss it. Anyway, Dylan, I'm glad you're here, and perhaps you could start us off by just sort of introducing this idea of choice-based assessment, and then how it differs from the more traditional assessment formats that people know about.
Sure. I will start by saying that the fundamental goal of education, of any kind of educational enterprise, is to prepare a learner to act independently in the world, which is to say, to make appropriate choices about how to behave in the world. So it's always been the case that the capacity for wise choice is what we as educators care about. It's what we want to impart on students. But it's a fairly tricky thing to measure. And in the last, let's say, 100 years or so, the way education has gone instead is by measuring the knowledge that students have accrued in the educational process. And that's not because that's the outcome we cared about. It's because it's a proxy for the outcome we cared about. We know that to make good choices, it helps to have good knowledge. So we measure the knowledge that students have as a way of measuring whether they are equipped to make good choices. The problem is, to have the knowledge is not sufficient. There are tons of examples in the education literature of students who produce the right answers on standardized tests, which is to say, they have acquired the knowledge they need, but they can't make good decisions about how to use that knowledge in the world. One famous area for this is physics. You get kids who ace physics courses, and then like 6 weeks later, you ask them to build something in the world, or you ask them even a simple question like what forces are acting upon a ball. And outside of the narrow framework in which they know how to pull out and regurgitate the knowledge that they've acquired, they can't actually bring that knowledge into the realm of action. They can't do anything good or interesting with that knowledge. So the idea is basically stop measuring the proxy for what we care about and measure what we actually care about. Now, the reason that we're proposing it now is because we understand that it's been intractable until now. It's very hard to set up any kind of scalable system that can assess the choices that learners make about how to learn in the absence of digital technologies. You have other kinds of assessments that get close to it, performance assessments, portfolio assessments, but they're not scalable. They're very time intensive, they're very consuming, they're very subjective. They're great, but they're sort of bespoke assessments rather than sort of uniform, the kinds of assessments you would roll out at scale. What digital technologies give is the possibility for producing environments that allow students to make choices in what to them is a fairly naturalistic setting, because kids these days are immersed in technology, so it's not hugely bewildering for them to be in a technological context making choices. But we have the capacity to capture all of those choices for asynchronous analysis and even for real-time analysis, so that you could imagine presenting learners with a choice-based environment in which we're not only assessing the learner's choices, but we're also adapting the environment in response to those choices to help prompt a learner towards better choices. Trivial example, if you're in some rich science simulation environment and you want to see whether a learner has adopted a good way of testing hypotheses, you present the learner with some system and you say, figure out how this system works. And the learner has various options for doing so. It could just the learner could perseverate, just run the system again and watch it, run it and watch it, run it and watch it. Or the learner could begin to isolate different pieces of the system, hold certain things constant while varying other things and determining what affects what. And if in the real-time environment you find that a learner is perseverating, just running a system with like 5 or 6 variables changing, the system could intelligently intervene and say something, oop, that functionality is worn out right now. See if you can focus on just one part of the system and understand it, and then maybe we'll fix it in the background to let you do the thing you were trying to do again. So what's happening there is the system is detecting a suboptimal choice pattern. It's detecting that this is a learner who is trying to understand the system by changing too many things at once. And the system can intervene, sort of close down the space, narrow the space for the learner to help the learner make choices that are going to help that learner learn what's going on in the system more effectively, and then back off on the constraints so that the learner can try to understand the system as a whole. I know that I have left a bunch of things open or uncertain, so I would welcome any kind of questions that you have to try to understand different aspects of what it is that we're talking about.
Let me ask you sort of a zoom out question real first, Dylan. So you offered this in terms of painting what this might look like in a concrete way. You talk about video game assessment, and you talk about law school, the approach in law school and assessment that's there. That they seem to be supportive of the kind of thing you're talking about. Can you sort of elaborate on those?
Sure. So the video game one is more the digital technology side that I talked about, right? You put kids into a rich enough simulation environment. It's an open enough space that they have opportunity to make lots of choices. And the digital technology allows you to capture all of those choices so that you can analyze what's going on. On the other side of things, the law school example is a good example of a non-digital instance of it. And the example is basically like this. You go to some law school, you spend 3 years learning highfalutin legal theory. But what you learn in law school doesn't actually prepare you to pass the bar exam, which is the test you need to take to be sort of given your lawyer license. So what happens is, after law school, you go and you spend the summer in some 6-week course preparing to take the bar exam. Now that course gives you a set of facts. It gives you a body of knowledge so that you can regurgitate that knowledge on the exam and prove that you're competent to be a lawyer. To do well in that course, you need to make intelligent choices about how to learn the material. So what the courses generally offer is they offer you like 5 or 6 different modalities for learning the same stuff. They give you a stack of books that's like a meter high. They give you recordings that you can play in the car. There are live lectures. There are like conversation groups that you can get together and have study groups with people. So there are lots of different avenues for success, different ways that law students can acquire the knowledge they need to pass the test. But to succeed, you have to make good choices about how to spend your time. Because if you try to do all of those things, you're gonna blow yourself out. You're gonna be duplicating effort. You're not gonna be learning everything. So the bar brief or the briefing, these courses, these 6-month-week courses, they require the ability to make good choices about how to learn to succeed. To do well in those courses means to have made good choices about how to succeed. In school, by contrast, you often don't have choices about how you learn material. You don't have choices about the order in which you learn it. You don't have choices about the time frame in which you learn it. You don't have choices about the modality through which you learn it. You don't have choices about the activities that allow you to practice sort of applying that knowledge. You have very little opportunity in formal educational environments as they currently stand in the US to learn how to make good choices about how to learn. The reason that's a problem now, more than it was, let's say 50 or 60 years ago, is previously the goal of education was served fairly well by giving kids a bunch of knowledge because they left the educational enterprise and went to work in a fairly stable environment where it was valuable to have a store of knowledge relevant to the task at hand in your head. And it was unlikely that you were going to need to radically change what you did or what you knew after schooling was done. You went to school, you learned some stuff, you went to your career, you did the stuff, you got a gold watch, you retired. Nowadays, kids are going to face maybe a dozen different career types in like 5 or 6 different fields. They're going to have to learn a ton of stuff after they're done with school. Things that probably weren't even in a position to be formalized when the kids were in school. So they are going to need much more than generations past, the ability to learn new things, to jump into a new space and to understand what's going on and to understand what kinds of choices they should make about how to pick up the new material. So we need to be giving students opportunities to make choices about how to learn in this sort of safe environment of schools, so that by the time they're out of school and on their own, they can succeed.
No, thanks for that explanation. So, hey, in the Hangout, Ben, Ethan, Brian, Carla, Mitch, Tim, who wants to jump in and either build on what Dylan has started us off with or probe at it, poke at it, ask questions?
I think one way...
Hey, I'll jump in.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Quick question and comment, kind of combo, is that what you're talking about is essentially allowing people to fail at an earlier and rapid pace in a lot of ways. I mean, I feel like that's a subtext of what it is you're describing. And I know it's something that is discussed a lot in the software industry is, you know, just get content, throw content out there and it's rapid cycle. And I'm wondering how much of that plays into what it is you're discussing.
You've hit on a really big tension in the paradigm of choice-based assessment, which is this: you want to give students the opportunities to make choices, but you also want to guide those choices. You want to scaffold the choice-making process so that there's as little face planting as possible. And it's tricky to constrain choices without undermining the autonomy that you're trying to encourage. But it's a balance that's, I mean, it's not something that's new to this paradigm, right? It's a balance that we strike all over the place. A professor of philosophy of education at Stanford, with whom I did some work, wrote a nice paper about the tension faced by Catholic parents in deciding whether or not to force their children to attend Sunday school and Mass so that they could learn enough about Catholicism to make a choice about whether to be Catholic themselves. So that tension between supporting choice, promoting choice, and constraining choice is definitely, it definitely runs through any talk of choice-based assessment, but it's not unique to that paradigm, is what I'm saying. It's a tension that we always have with learners.
So I think our view is coming at it from a slightly different perspective, which is both organizational as well as pedagogical. So we see a big part of the challenge here as being that we've done so much in schools, less so out of school for I think obvious reasons, but so much in schools to homogenize our expectations for what kids should know and then how we're going to assess it. And I think what that's done then is limit the kinds of choices, the space of choices that kids have room to make, the kinds of pedagogical decisions that teachers have room to make. And I think that ends up making schools less and less desirable places for kids to be to learn, for teachers to feel empowered as teachers. There's a really nice article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette this weekend about a parent sort of pulling her kids out of the standardized testing system. I'd recommend it. And so for our question is the article. So our question, I think our question that we're really motivated by is how do we bring creativity back to school, but at the same time make it so that teachers have ways to account for the learning that's happening. So on the one hand, you could say, well, let's just let kids creatively explore whatever they want, but that doesn't really work today in a system where teachers have to be accountable, have to be able to say, hey, here's some evidence that the students in my class learned X, Y, and Z. And they might be doing it all kinds of different ways. And in the law school analogy, you might choose path A through the 6-week course, and someone else might choose path D. But at the end of the day, you're taking the bar exam, and that's the filter function that's going to matter. And it may not be the case that we need to just have one filter function, right? At the end of the day, the teachers just need to be able to say, hey, here's the skills and expertise and the set of choices that demonstrate that for each kid, and those might be diverse choices. And we're really interested in thinking about ways then that we can account for creativity and inventive learning, both at the individual and the classroom level. So maybe that's about measuring the diversity of solutions that kids come up with to challenges. So on an individual basis, you could say, hey, this kid tried this approach, and this approach, and had reasonable, explanations for why they did that as a measure of their own thinking about a problem. Or it could happen at a classroom level where you could say, hey, the class got this challenge and there were 10 different solutions proposed. That suggests that this is an activity that's really generative for learning. But then that raises the question of, as a teacher, how are you going to attend to and have a way of knowing how kids are being productive and help nudge them on track? Because some of those ways might be more productive than others, right? So how do we do those kinds of analyses of process and diversity to empower learning? That's kind of how we think about this issue.
I was just going to say, I really like what you brought up, Carla, about the idea of failure. And I actually sort of disagree, Dylan. I think face planting is awesome if you've created an environment in which people know that that's okay and that you pick yourself up. And that's really hard because you have to, teachers then need to feel, whether it's a teacher, teaching artist in an out-of-school setting or an in-school setting, have to have built this environment in the sense that they can step back and let kids make those mistakes. And then what you guys were just saying is, how do you then help them have that metacognition moment of like, oh, maybe there's a better way to do this, or maybe I'm perseverating. And what's fascinating to me is, if anyone out here has seen examples of people who are doing that well, or places that are really consciously helping kids understand the choice-making paths or patterns that they're getting involved in.
One example of that I know about, I don't think it's ready yet, but there is a game designer named Jesse Schell. He's in Pittsburgh, and he's working on a research project with, I think, some med school people at Yale or something. The idea is to build a set of games to try to encourage more health-promoting behaviors in at-risk youth. But the angle that they've taken is to play through these games. They're sort of role-playing games, and it's like, hey, your buddy offers you some drugs. Do you want to take the drugs? But to succeed in the games, you have to make the wrong choices. You have to walk down those paths. You have to explore the suboptimal sort of trajectories. So that's a learning environment that is designed not only to let kids make bad choices, but in some sense the curriculum actually requires that the kids make the sort of the fun, dangerous, interesting, countercultural, whatever choices, and then they play through the ramifications of those choices. They see the downstream effects, and they have to explore all of those paths in order to unlock the next chapters of the story.
Mitch, did you have a take on one of these points?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's really fascinating, and I think this is a great way to go. The question I have, I'm at the college level and I'm in a classroom, and I ask them, what do you guys want to do with this class? How can we open this up? How can we explore different learning methods? And what I continually find, and I found this at an earlier age, even with my kids, is that we're all trained early on to participate in this industrial kind of educational process, where they're just satisfying the need to be in the class and satisfying the tests and so forth. So I'm wondering, kind of from a broader perspective or broader lens here, it's great to get this into the K-12. Is it too late for the college student already in the classroom to do that? I mean, I'm frustrated in the classroom when I want people to be creative. Or I'll tell you an experience I had back when my kids were in 4th grade. We had this Destination Imagination program, which some of you might be familiar with. And even at the 4th grade level, you know, it was let's play, let's open up, let's explore, let's take this path of allowing ourselves to fail and just explore. And even in 4th grade, they had still already sort of shut down. So I'm just curious to think what the group thinks about that. Is it too late for the college student?
It's on the one hand, kids get to college by learning how to play the game of school. So they've been inculcated into a certain way of thinking about formal learning. But on the other hand, it's not too late. It's a great time for kids who are on the path to adulthood to begin to have less structure and more opportunity to make their own choices. So I think it's absolutely not too late. It should definitely be encouraged. There are some engineering programs that are learning this. They're learning basically that they've got their curricula flipped. So a lot of engineering programs, they have 3 years of methods courses and knowledge-based, sort of rigidly dictated curricula, followed by a senior year in which the kids are supposed to open it up, and you're like, now, you know, create and be a designer and come up with new things. And by that time, the kids who are sticking around are the kids who were willing to put up with that 3 years of rigid, controlled learning trajectories. And it's not how they have come to think about themselves as engineers. So a nice model that some universities are doing is flipping that, so that it's in the first year that the kids get to experience what it's like to make interesting choices, and in some cases, as Tim pointed out, to fail, to try to build a catapult in a really bad way, for instance. And it's after they've had those experiences and realize that there are gaps in their own knowledge that they go into the slightly more rigorous and controlled methods courses that give them the tools that now they appreciate that they need.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that and wholeheartedly agree. And I can relate to you, Mitch, completely. In my class, I go, hey, final project, do whatever you want. And the kids come and go, just tell me what to do. I can't handle this sort of too wide open. And at Tufts, we've done that flipping that Dylan was just talking about, where our first year students now come in and do hands-on project-based engineering type programs. And here at the Center for Engineering Education and Outreach, we've been looking at engineering K-12. So we've been looking at how do we bring those same engineering ideas that you were just talking about into the 4th grade and give those kids those opportunities to explore and design and develop and create. And what we often see is now an examination of the process. So we see a lot of guess and test. Okay, that's one way of trying to evaluate those choices, but are there better ways? Are there ways to actually analyze the choices you have in front of you, not go down every path, to explore, to evaluate, to feel that's the kids assessing the choices that they're making, and then how do we structure it also so that the teachers can assess the choices the students are making, and most importantly, reflect on that. It's not just about getting that summative grade at the end, but how do we do this along the way? How do we have the formative assessment of the types of choices the students are making so that they can reflect on that, learn from that, and then hopefully we see that transfer of knowledge that gets back to the I learned physics in the classroom but can't actually apply it in the real world. Can they start to apply those same processes and the good decisions they made during those processes to other problems, to other engineering problems, but also to bigger life problems?
Hey, let's circle back to for a moment to this question of how do you have an environment that is safe for kids to face plant, fail, explore, and experiment. And Carla, you had an interesting point about how badges you think can help create that. So let's take that one.
Sure. Thanks. So I think there are lots of opportunities here that open badges can acknowledge. They're not the solution to everything, obviously, but there are lots of ways to develop badge systems that can act in different ways for assessments, right? So the fact that there are formal systems already in place within the formal academic world, that there are grades and that people are essentially aiming to get grades in order to be acknowledged and move on, and that everybody's kind of teaching to the tests, then if we think of open badges as the opportunity to start acknowledging all the things that are not currently addressed within that system, and start recognizing that there are new methods of assessment that make perfect sense but are really hard and to implement in these very formalized environments. And if we think about badges as kind of a non-systematized tool, so that they are something that can be used in a variety of different ways. And one thing that I keep thinking as I'm hearing these conversations, one, so I have an undergrad degree in graphic design, and I can tell you, if you give anyone the solve anything, choose your own problem, you're going to run into problems, right? Because essentially people need parameters, and there's all kind of psychological research that backs this up, which is like the paradox of choice. Too much choice makes people freeze, not enough makes them work within really narrow confines. And so that's one thing. But then I would say, thinking about badges as an opportunity to start acknowledging that peers can assess each other, that they can do self-assessment. Like, one of the things that I'm repeatedly hearing here is that self-assessment is something, and I tend to think of self-assessment as like the highest rung of assessment. Because if you are capable of self-assessing, you're generally more typically hard on yourself than other people are. Although there's also some research that indicates that people think more highly of themselves than they necessarily should. But at the same time, if you can introduce expert and peer and self and get all of those things working at the same time, this is where badges can start to come into play. You can start to develop badge systems or allow students themselves to develop their badge systems that start acknowledging their own successes and failures, that they can then start to think about in a constructive manner. So instead of someone saying, perform this task, and then an expert will judge you against that. If you can say, all right, you need to define the task, here are some loose parameters, but then you will also be assessing yourself and your peers will be assessing you based on those same concepts, all of a sudden it changes the game a lot. And as soon as you ask people to develop methods where they will be assessed themselves, they start to become a lot more focused, because they've not only bought in personally to that concept, but then they're also recognizing that this is something that could then be used elsewhere. So they take on the role of teacher or mentor. And so it starts to ask people a lot of different questions, and it starts to operate in a different environment, and recognizing that that different environment can then roll outward. So while we start small, and I mean, you can think about this as a coding problem, right? Or even a systems problem, and that's how I'm thinking about it, is recognizing that you're operating within a system. Can you alter things within that system that then can roll outward and affect other systems? And so while we're not saying that badges will solve everything, or that necessarily it's useful in every instance, if you can introduce them on a level where it starts to make sense, then I think it's one of those growing and evolutionary concepts that can evolve slowly, where it starts to have a significant impact, and then people can start to think about themselves as wholer beings rather than, I'm just good at this one subject.
I wanted to circle back to something that the point that Mitch, or a question that Mitch had asked, and one of my colleagues, I want to ask what are the issues, Dylan? Like, there are technological issues, there are sociological issues. It seems like there's layers of issues, and I asked the question in the context of I have a colleague that has a school in Chicago that's trying many of these sort of interesting new assessment approaches, and some of the pushback that they've gotten from it's a K-12 school, from parents, but also even the kids, is they wonder whether or not, having fun and doing things that are fun and doing things that are, if it's actually learning, they have questions about that because they're so indoctrinated with learning shouldn't be fun. And then there's this very practical concern articulated by the parents that, boy, this seems great, but how are they going to do on the end of the year exams? So it just seems like there's a lot of issues here. What's your sort of take on that as you've examined this?
I think, as Ben was hinting at early on, it is definitely the case that where assessment leads, instruction is going to follow. And right now, the zeitgeist in assessment has been simplistic, standards-based, very, very drill-focused. And if I'm a parent, I'm right to be concerned. I'm right to say, look, my kid is having great experiences, and that's awesome. And I might even trust you as a teacher that my son is learning something. But if he's not going to shine on the standardized tests that are going to get him into Stanford, then why am I wasting my time with it? Why is he wasting his time with it? I think there are some really good examples of schools, K-12 schools, that are managing to balance being accountable to an antiquated set of assessments with giving their learners the kinds of competencies and the kinds of opportunities that they need to succeed in the 21st century. One that always springs to mind for me is Katie Salen's Quest to Learn School. They are a New York public school, which means that they have to take the Regents exam. They have to take all the same standardized tests that the other kids in New York have to take. But in this school, there aren't classes, there aren't tests. Instead, there are like missions and quests, and you don't have grades, you have levels, and you can level up on things. And it's not the case that everybody needs to, at the end of the journey, have the same homogenized set of facts that they've sort of internalized. Instead, you get the formation early on of cross-functional teams, and you get kids who come out with very different sets of competencies. So you have some kids who are very specialized in a certain set of things, and certain kids who are specialized in a different set of things. And the classroom as a whole has great coverage because they have these complementary skill sets being developed. But the individual kids don't have to all take the same shape by the end of the schooling process. What I love about Quest to Learn is that the kids at the Quest to Learn schools are scoring just the same as all of the rest of the kids in New York on the standardized tests. They are not losing ground because their learning activities are richer and more individualized. But it's a hard thing to do. I mean, Katie and her team have done really good work to make that happen. But that's a proof of concept. It's a construction proof that it is possible to do it.
Let's throw this this question that came in from the live stream out to everyone. It's a great question. So what are the types of things that we should be measuring in the opinion of all of you in the Hangout? And this is a great question for everybody to sort of weigh in with their particular perspective on.
That's actually something that's come up in a project we've been working on here called Integrating Engineering and Literacy. Basically, we've been going into 4th through 6th grade classrooms and taking the books that they're reading in those classrooms and having the kids extract engineering problems from it, evaluate the books, like here are the problems the characters are facing, and develop solutions for those problems. So they're basically authoring their own solutions outside of the text. And we start seeing what choices they're making as a group. What problems are they addressing? What techniques are they using to address those problems? What are they deciding as they're testing of like what is the process by which they're going to test these solutions? And then overall, what's the diversity of solutions they have created? And we're really trying to figure out right now like how to examine the process that they're going through, how to quantify some of these measures, how to qualify, how much communication is going back and forth. When they do share outs, are they integrating the suggestions of the other students? Is that something we want to measure?
And what's exciting about it, as opposed to everyone coming to that same piece of knowledge, instead we see a diversity of solutions, and then the opportunity for them to learn from each other based on those diversity of solutions that are generated by those students. And some of what Brian's been doing is, how do we quantify that diversity? How do we look at what is creativity in that sort of scenario?
That's so interesting because it totally connects to the work that we're doing both in the out-of-school space at the Art Center and certainly in our 42 public school partnerships is, how do you begin to put something that people value as a measure in terms of some of the things that we see when kids are working in small groups on creating projects in the curriculum that are arts-based, which is, how are they reflecting on their work and then coming up with new solutions when they failed? How are they working together? You guys mentioned in your introduction the idea of being able to collaborate, which more and more is going to be something that everybody in the work world has to do. Is people toss that around, that word, it's a catchphrase. But when you really see it in action, there are skills, really hard skills that are connected to effective collaboration. And then also how to express your point of view and your opinions. That's a skill that you can develop as you reflect on, talk about your own process as an artist, talk about what you learned the first couple times you created something, and then talk about sort of the point of view you developed as you created your piece. We include a lot of social justice pedagogy in our work because, you know, it meshes incredibly well with arts integration. And the point, and the fact is, every artist always has a really strong point of view. It's very rare that you'd find an artist that doesn't have a strong point of view about an issue, a good one, you know, about something that they care about. And so those are really cool things to measure. And it's really exciting to hear you guys talking about doing that with an engineering-based curriculum.
Carla and Mitch, what's your guys' take on this? What kinds of things should we be measuring? What should we be actually caring about?
I think Tim makes a good point. I mean, I'm really familiar with the artistic process. We have a school full of creatives here, and there's something in that artistic workflow that suggests potential for measurement, and it maybe is those things that I think Brian was talking about too, the collaborative aspect, the process, sort of the metacognition of the process. You know, we're able to measure other details, you know, knowledge-based details. We kind of know how to do that, but it's sort of the inside of the method there that's the tricky thing. So I don't know, collaboration I think is important. Understanding at what point, you know, students learn and learn how they learn is another good opportunity. I think you take a look at the artist workflow, because like you said, Tim, you know, they've been doing it for a long time, and I think artists take that for granted, you know, that there's a process there and that they learn as they go. They're seeing the world, they're getting information, and they're spitting it back, which is what knowledge and education is. So there's something in there. I guess I'm not quite sure how to define it, but there's something there.
So I feel like that's like the $64,000 question. What should we be assessing? It's almost not a fair question, in that I think that you have thousands of different viewpoints, and again, this is kind of where, you know, obviously I'm coming from the open badges world, where I think there's lots of opportunities to allow people to develop their own concept of assessment and to acknowledge what's important within context, right? So to me, when we talk about assessment, context is vital, and that you kind of cannot remove one thing from the other, and recognizing that some things are really valuable and meaningful within one context and entirely meaningless in another context. So while we've all been talking about creativity, I entirely agree with that. You know, I come from a family full of artists, but at the same time, I recognize that there are a lot of people don't necessarily think about things from that perspective. While it can bring different concepts of understanding from taking different lenses, recognizing that in some environments it's less meaningful than it is in others. So therefore, an assessment that would be just based on creativity might be more problematic ultimately in the long run. But at the same time, so I'm answering I'm saying this lots of different ways. The other thing that I'm thinking about too is I'm heading off to the Hewlett Grantees Foundation meeting, and there are a few things, and they're talking about deeper learning skills. And I know this is something we hear quite a bit at Mozilla, which is about 21st century skills. And while I really dislike that name, that definition, I think that the things that it's trying to represent are really important, right? And those are things like critical thinking, problem solving, effective communication, collaboration, and understanding where and how you need help. So understanding your sense of self within an environment and a community. So I think that from that standpoint, do those things need to be measured or quantified? I don't know the answer to that. My instinct says no, not everything should be measured, not everything should be quantified. And at the same time, if we do measure them, we have to recognize again that context is vital.
All right, Dylan, I think you had a point you wanted to make here about choice and failure.
Yeah, one good example from the report about something that we can capture with choice-based assessments that we can't with knowledge-based assessments, and that gets close to something that we think is worth measuring, is responses to failure. As Tim mentioned, it's a huge part of the artistic process. It's definitely part of the design process. And if you have a simple knowledge-based assessment, you'll get something, but you won't get that. In this study that's cited in the report, a colleague of mine, Kathy Chase, she created a game-like environment in which kids were learning about Mendelian genetics. And there were different planets that focused on different concepts within that sort of space, that topic. At each planet, you could sort of test yourself, your knowledge on certain questions. So it was a knowledge-focused environment, but it was a choice-based assessment environment because kids had freedom to move among the planets as they chose, and they had freedom to stay on each planet for as long as they wanted or to leave. What Kathy was able to discover is that by looking at what happened after students failed a test on a certain planet, she learned a lot. It turns out that kids who went to a planet and failed and then abandoned and then went to some other planet, rather than sticking there, reading the resources, trying again, playing games at an easier level or something like that, that response to failure explained a huge proportion of the variance in these students' math scores in school, totally separate from the experiment, and their science scores. It explained, I think, something like a third or a half of the variance in their semester science grades. And again, this is one very short assessment. It's a single day interaction, but looking at their responses to failure was very predictive of how well these students were doing in other classes in their formal learning environments. So choice-based assessments to measure responses to failure, I think there's a lot of potential there to help teachers and students focus on something that is worth learning, worth measuring, worth valuing as an outcome of education.
For a moment, Dylan, I wanted to track back to something Tim had said about the connection that they go after with art and social justice, because you make this point that assessment, and especially choice-based assessment, is tied to democracy and free society. And I was very interested to hear a bit more about that. So how do you, what's the connection there? And if that's the case, it seems like it's even more of an urgent issue than a question of, whether we're measuring learning in the right way, if it's something that's actually even larger than that.
There are several camps about what the goals of education are. You can sort of think of them as three buckets. There's one bucket that says, well, we need widgets for all of the different layers of social machinery. We need CEOs and ditch diggers, and we need to sort of spread students out and decide who's going to be which widget. There's another I think, more optimistic and egalitarian perspective on the goals of education, according to which, at the end of the educational process, what we should have are citizens, people who are engaged with the maintenance of our community, of our country, of our society. You can't get there simply by giving students a set of facts. Even if you succeeded perfectly at instilling knowledge, you wouldn't get there. What you need is to help students learn how to make choices. And this is where it gets very tricky, because it goes back to supporting choice without undermining or constraining choice. In a similar way, you want to ensure that students can make good choices about how to learn and how to think about deep and complex issues, but you don't want necessarily to be in a position of saying, this choice for president is a bad choice, for instance, or this choice about how to live your life is a bad choice. So there's a real tightrope walk to be done, but getting into the social justice context, the civic participation context, is an important possibility for choice-based assessments.
I wanted to ask, does anyone in the Hangout have something to tag up with that large point that Dylan just made? Otherwise, I'll go to something new and ask.
I have a quick question.
Carla?
Is there? Sorry, Tim. So is there a correct? So I'm wondering if we're saying that there's a correct way to think about problems and issues, because when we start thinking about choice-based assessment, we're acknowledging that there are multiple pathways to get to one answer. So I think that oh yeah, that's a great book. So that's it.
The book that Carla is referring to is Paul Tufts' book, How Children Succeed, just so everybody knows that.
Well, I just wanted to mention, to pick up on something Dylan was saying, which is the idea of how crucial it becomes to have young people. And it's so cool to me as I'm listening to this conversation and really talk about choice-based assessment, how it really connects to the idea of really feeling that they have developed the ability to really ask tough questions, both of themselves and the material they're reading, or what they're studying. I mean, it's about really digging deeper and digging deeper. And that's what made me think of Paul Tufts' book as one of the key issues is resilience. And so it's like, you know, and sort of grit. And if you have grit as a student and as a researcher, you're not going to accept easy answers. You're not going to accept it when somebody says this is the right person for president. You'll say why, or why do you think that? And then sort of come up with your own opinion. It's really interesting how that loop can reinforce itself in a way.
I wanted to ask, this is for everybody to hang out. We have a lot of practitioners, teachers at K-12 as well as in higher education that are just looking for really practical ways to try some of these things. And so what would you suggest? I mean, if you have an educator that is really interested in trying to do right by their students, even though they may be in a context that's hard, I mean, what are the sorts of things that people can do? Where can they go?
I think that good news for the prospect of choice-based assessments is that in the classroom, teachers are often already doing these kinds of things. They're already providing their learners with opportunities to make choices that tell the teacher something about how those learners are thinking about the concepts that they're exploring in the classroom. It's that middle level where it starts to get hard. District level tests, end of year tests, that kind of stuff. That's very constrained. But within the school year, from week to week, teachers are often already doing something that could very well be characterized as choice-based assessment. They're giving students opportunities within learning activities, and the teachers are observant, basically. They're paying attention to the kinds of choices the kids are making, and they're helping to guide those choices. It comes back to that tension between giving kids freedom to roam and guiding what kids are doing. And it starts early. I mean, as early as preschool, you have teachers who lay out materials for kids, and the kids come into a room and there are all sorts of materials, so the kids can choose what to do. But those choices are constrained to the activities that the teachers have decided are appropriate and have laid out for them. And if the teachers see the kids using the materials in certain ways, they can engage the kids in conversation about, oh, that's an interesting way to use that. What else might you do with it? Or how might you get that piece to work with that piece, or something like that. So the teacher is guiding the exploration and observing the choices that the kids are making every day.
There was a follow-up to that question, Dylan, which is, I'm curious to what your answer would be for this. It looks like it was one of the teachers in the live stream had asked, or one of the practitioners, is this something that we have to wait to come down from the top, or is this something we can do immediately and sort of right away and be empowered to go after it?
Any teacher in a classroom could certainly do this. And even could do it while holding themselves accountable to the ill-fitting assessments that are mandated from outside or from above. The Quest to Learn School is a good example of that. It's a group of educators who have decided that they're going to achieve the goals that are mandated by state policy in an unusual way, an interesting way. So it can absolutely happen from the bottom up. And it can only happen from the bottom up in some sense, because ETS has done some really interesting experimental work in choice-based assessment. ETS, Educational Testing Service, people often think of them as the sort of staid and stodgy psychometricians who make tests in the sort of bubble form, Scantron, multiple choice paradigm. But ETS actually does a lot of work in new kinds of assessments too. But ETS is they're not a policy setting organization. They're experts in making tests, and they won't produce those tests for a mass market until the kinds of stakeholders who can sway what counts as useful assessment demand those things. And those stakeholders policymakers, higher learning education institutions, they won't make the switch either until there is enough pressure on them to do so. A policymaker who switched from a standardized test to a choose your own adventure test would probably be hung from a flagpole, unless his or her constituents made it absolutely clear that that's what they value. So I think the change has to come patchwork from the bottom up.
Yeah, and we're here at the center, we're big believers in that sort of grassroots campaign kind of concept as well of the teachers having to work within those constraints, and every teacher has different constraints. Some are down to pacing charts where every minute is dictated what they're supposed to be teaching, and so in that environment, yes, certainly it's going to be much more difficult. I love the idea that you had of talking about, you know, kindergartners with their choice of materials. We can do that at all different ages. In your high school physics classroom, when you're doing an experiment, you can lay out all the materials and say, hey, you don't have to follow this worksheet of these are the specific steps, but go and experiment, and each group within the class might choose their different pathways, and the real learning is going to come when you start comparing those and start comparing the differences between the groups and what could be taken away from each of those. Now, can you do it in your classroom? Yes, you can, but you have to be prepared. It's a very chaotic experience, and so this sort of management and the teacher being able to control all of those simultaneous pathways, it becomes a difficult problem. And that's where certainly we think that digital technologies can come in to help coordinate, help facilitate that collaboration, help manage all of those different aspects. But then suddenly now it's that teacher trying to bring it back together and finding those learning moments where those students can reflect on what they actually did and what can be taken away from it. And I just caution that perhaps it's not all about arriving at that final right answer, right? So that right answer, that we're always sort of that piece of knowledge, but maybe we'll arrive at different pieces of knowledge, but those pathways that we took, perhaps that's the important part that we're looking for along the way.
Do you think that, Dylan, I guess it's for you and anybody actually who's working with kids, I mean, how would and how do youth and students respond to this sort of approach versus what they're subjected to, you know, through most of their schooling lives? Even in your sort of observation and experiment and trying new things, what is the response?
It varies. If you start them young enough, it's perfectly natural. It's how children begin to learn about the world. But as Mitch pointed out, there's a point at which students have learned enough about how school is played that they begin to understand that something weird is going on. And they will either revel in that and say, oh, we're off task, we're off topic, yes, or they'll get very uptight and very concerned and they'll say, no, but is this going to be on the test? How is this going to help me get to whatever I've decided is the right next step for me? So I've seen a range of potential responses to it, and the best way to manage it is to help the students understand that this kind of capacity, the kind of capacity to be productive in an open context like this and to make the learning one's own is a very useful skill to have as an adult. I think is a good way to get the buy-in that you need from the students for it.
We're getting to the top of the hour, and I wanted to give everybody in the Hangout just a sort of a moment to have a last thought or provocative question or anything. Let's start on the far left there with Ben, Ethan, and Brian, and then we'll finish up with Dylan. I think you guys' mic is off. Mike, I think your mic is off. Carla, let's go to you.
Okay, so the thing that it's just been a fantastic conversation, and just to wrap up really briefly, I think the thing that I keep hearing and that I myself have come around to and is part of the paper that I'm writing is essentially the idea of pathways and allowing, and that's exactly what choice-based assessment is acknowledging that people can follow different pathways and they can arrive at kind of a rough consensus of what might be considered right, but the different pathways are vital to actually having people be able to think and get that metacognition that we're talking about.
Thanks, Carla. Mitch?
Yeah, fascinating conversation. Thanks, everybody. It's just been a pleasure. I think the final thread there, where it was top top-down, bottom-up is an interesting one. I mean, I think everything that that we're all working on is this kind of bottom-up thing, but there's good signs, I think, from the top-down and from the big top-down from the Department of Education in a recent letter that's talking about competency-based education and looking at working with schools, working with colleges to explore those type of changes in the credit hour scenario. I think those things are very exciting, and look forward to that part of the conversation continuing. Uh-oh.
Yeah, that is good news. I think Ben and Ethan and Brian, are you back with us? We still can't hear you.
Yeah, we are. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right, go ahead. We're on sort of last thoughts here, so go ahead, guys.
So I think for us, the key thing is thinking about how we simultaneously help empower teachers and other educators within the organizational context that they're in, which puts a lot of pressure on them, while at the same time thinking about how are you creating environments that support diversities of ways of engaging with interesting ideas, whether those are material ways of doing it or different perspectives. So one way of thinking about this is how do you value the diversity of backgrounds that kids bring in terms of the things they care about and that they're passionate about, and that maybe means thinking about different schools. It would make sense to have different kinds of design or engineering or writing challenges, and thinking about, well, at the end of the day, if we are going to hold people accountable to same standards across these places, how do we help empower practitioners to create those mappings between those diverse, not only goals, but ways of pursuing those goals and contexts.
Thanks, you guys. Tim?
So I just wanted to pick up very quickly on Dylan's last point, which is the idea of how young people respond to this type of choice, these sort of opportunities, and it's also the idea of pathways. It's really interesting to see when we have kids that we've worked with and every year they get to learn in this way, how adept they become at it. And then when they're older and it gets introduced, sometimes you have kids saying, well, what's the right answer? And you have to sort of break that mold. And so it's really interesting to see for me to see how important it is to invest from an early age in this type of thing. Not that it's impossible to break, but that's a really amazing realization, sort of based on what you were just saying, Dylan. And then I think what you were just saying, Ben, is the idea of investing in helping teachers understand how to create these environments and being comfortable with them. That's the big question. When you come down to the practitioner thing, it's like, how do we help, how do we support teachers to do this type of assessment and to create environments where it's embraced?
Thanks, Tim. And Dylan, you have the last word, and then I'll just do some housekeeping here.
I think that an interesting avenue for exploration for researchers and for anybody who's interested in thinking about it is, if you did have a top-down change, you would want, as Carla has pointed out, to support outcomes that look different. But you would need, because it's a requirement of the kinds of standards-based assessment paradigms we have, to have some relatively uniform set of criteria or competencies. As Mitch pointed out, there was a letter about competency-based assessments, competency-based instruction. So it's interesting to think about how you might move the standards upstream. For instance, not, oh, you need to be able to do this particular calculus formation. Instead, you pull the standards upstream and you say, for instance, kids need to be able to critically evaluate claims. Kids need to be able to make choices about their own possible futures and think well about ramifications of actions. You know, like stuff that's far enough upstream that we could agree that no matter what particular career path a student chooses, that skill set is a good skill set to have. So I think it would be interesting to do work in that area and try to come up with some set that would serve the purposes of uniform instruction, uniform assessment, while also allowing for the kinds of individualized instructions that we recognize are necessary and important.
Well, I want to thank you all for the conversation, all of you for being here and your time, Ben, Ethan, Brian, Carla, Dylan, Mitch, and Tim. We can keep the conversation going and sharing resources on this really important topic on the site. By this afternoon, we'll have a full recording of the webinar and all the other curated content up in the archive section of connectedlearning.tv. You can also post comments or anything on that page as well. And then to keep things going on Twitter, we would love you to use the hashtag Connected Learning. And then our next webinar session is Thursday, April 11th, so a week from Thursday, 9 to 10 a.m. Pacific time, and we will be chatting with Liz Lawley, who is a professor of interactive games and media at Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. And she is using some really interesting, she's approaching the social and academic experience of her undergrads in a really interesting way, sort of experimenting and innovating in some of the ways we're talking about today. So thank you everyone for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, totally.
Thanks.